Several times in the prophets, John the Baptist was prophesied about. Did you know that? John the Baptist was actually prophesied about in Malachi and in Isaiah explicitly. Now, you might be saying to yourself, I've never read Malachi or Isaiah and seen John the Baptist being prophesied about. And that is because the literal fulfillment of those prophecies didn't necessarily line up with the prophetic expectation that people had when they read the original passages. What do I mean by this exactly? Jewish people in the first century had an expectation that Elijah, the prophet, was going to return in the days leading up to the coming of the Messiah.
The people hold me to be a prophet. Some say Elijah himself.
In fact, Jesus actually confirmed this and told his disciples that this had already come to pass. But it wasn't Elijah who they saw. In other words, that wasn't a literal thing that Elijah was going to come back from heaven. It was that the prophets were foreshadowing someone who would come in the spirit and power of Elijah, which is what it actually says in Luke 1:17, that John came in the spirit and power of Elijah. Remember when the disciples responded to Jesus's question when they were in Caesarea Philippi? This is recorded in 3 of the Gospels. It might even be 4. And Jesus looks at them and says, "Who do people say that I am?" And the disciples say, "Some say you're Moses, some say you're Elijah, some say you're this, some say you're that." And then Jesus says to them, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter responds, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." That's actually a Hebraism. Peter is actually identifying Jesus as Yahweh in that passage, but that's for another time. The reason that Jesus asked them the question and the disciples said, "Well, some people say you're Elijah," is because there was this Jewish expectation in the first century that Elijah was going to be a forerunner for the Messiah. This is the same reason why some of the Pharisees asked John in John chapter 1, John the Baptist I'm talking about. They said, "Are you Elijah?" And John says, "No, I'm not Elijah. I'm not literally Elijah, but he was the one who came in the spirit and power of Elijah." Jesus actually confirms this for the disciples explicitly in Matthew chapter 11. But let me just read to you really quickly how the Old Testament ends, so you get a full picture of what Jewish people were thinking in the first century when they were expecting Elijah to come as a forerunner before the Messiah. Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6 say this. They say, "Remember the law of my servant Moses." Oh, that's verse 4. I'll start in verse 4. "Remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction." This is literally how the Old Testament ends, with God promising to send Elijah before the great and awesome day of the Lord. I'd love to get into what that's a reference to, but we don't have time for that. We're trying to stay on point tonight. Now, in Matthew chapter 11, just to drive this point home, Jesus confirms that John had been Elijah who was to come before him. This is what he says to his disciples in Matthew 11, starting at verse 7. "And as they went, Jesus began to speak to the crowds concerning John. 'What did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing?' Remember, Elijah was a prophet who lived in the wilderness. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? He was a man who wore fur. He wore fur. His clothing was like fur coats. He lived off of ravens and wild honey and fish that were brought to him by the Lord. Actually, he was this wild sort of creature. Jesus is saying, what did you go out in the wilderness to see? Someone who was like Elijah. And if you skip down to verse 13, this is what Jesus says to wrap this little conversation up. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. That's who John the Baptist was. He was the fulfillment of the prophetic picture of Elijah coming before the Messiah to prepare the way for him. Thanks for watching. My name is Blake, and over the past 20 years, I've been a missionary, a pastor, and a Bible college and seminary professor. During that entire time, I've been teaching the Bible. And if you want more Bible content to come your way, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like this video. And also, check out this video right here.